Right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Middle East Forum's webinar and podcast series featuring talks from the Forum's projects. My name is Winfield Myers. I'm the Director of Campus Watch, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. Our format will be a 15-minute discussion that I will hold with our guests, followed by a 15-minute Q&A from you, the audience, and from me. If you wish to type in a question, you may do so at the bottom of your screen on the Q&A box. I'm pleased to welcome our guest today, who is joining us by phone, Professor Darío Fernández-Morera, who is Associate Professor of Spanish and Portuguese Emeritus at Northwestern University. Darío, welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm honored.
We're very honored to have you. Our topic today is the myth of the Andalusian paradise. This myth holds that in medieval Spain, occupied by Muslims at that point, a culture emerged that was an idyllic paradise, virtually, in which tolerance and convivencia prevailed, and where Muslims, Christians, and Jews tolerated one another and indeed got along beautifully under the benevolent rule of Muslim rulers. This, however, is a false picture, as Professor as Professor Fernández-Morera is going to tell us, because it rests on a culture of forgetting, as he calls it. To begin our discussion, Darío, let me just note that in graduate school studying medieval and Renaissance history, I certainly heard this myth. I won't say there was no opposition to it, but it was the prevailing historiography with which we were presented at that time. What are the principal elements of this myth to begin with, before we get into why it's false? What does it hold precisely?
Well, perhaps the most common view is that Christians were treated generally well, except for a few unfortunate occasions, and Jews as well. So there was no reason for them to feel too bad under Islamic rule. And related to this view are the beliefs that basically good relations existed between Christians and Muslims, especially under the tolerant Umayyad, with some exceptions, of course.
Darío, I'm being asked by our host if you could please speak up just a little bit.
Louder, you mean?
Yes, sir, louder a little bit. Thank you.
Okay. And that both sides learned a great deal from each other, and that we should learn today from this successful experiment in diversity and inclusiveness. Look, in the conclusion to my book, can you hear me now well?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
In the conclusion to my book, I quote a very respected professor of medieval Spanish at Cambridge University. He is president of the Modern Humanities Research Association and editor of the Modern Language Review. And he was honored by the Spanish government with the order of a commander of the Order of Isabel la Católica for his contributions to the understanding of Spain. And he writes, and quote, "Modern historians seem to agree that the invasion was not particularly cruel or destructive, and it is certain that Muslims, already familiar with both religions in the Middle East, were taught to respect Christians and Jews as people of the book. Moreover, large Christian populations lived for centuries in Al-Andalus with legal rights and relative freedom of worship." Well, every one of these statements does not correspond to the facts. I can go over them if you wish, or we can do that at the discussion time. But this is the basic outline of the myth of the Andalusian paradise.
What are what you'd call the principal falsehoods, given our limitations on time today? What are the principal parts of the myth that you just described that are false and that can be proved false? You and others have proved them through the research into primary sources.
Yes. the reference to the great treatment in the Middle East, I suggest that readers consult the work of Raymond Ibrahim. He has a lot to say about the treatment of Christians in the Middle East. This professor from Cambridge University points out that the invasion was not particularly cruel or destructive. Well, the entire civilization of Christian Visigoth Spain was destroyed. The great city of Recopolis, with aqueducts, printing presses, paved streets, and so forth, eventually disappeared. And the population, the Christian population of Al-Andalus, by the 13th century had practically disappeared. There were very few Christians left when Christians entered Valencia, for example. And in Granada, of course, the Christians that were there when Granada capitulated in 1492, they were Christian slaves. There were no Christians left in Granada in 1492. What about the teaching of Muslims learning to respect Christians and Jews as people of the book? Well, Ibn Hazm of Cordova, one of the best minds of Christian Spain, who was of Christian ancestry, as were most of the intellectuals of Al-Andalus were of Christian ancestry.
Darío, I'm being asked again if you could please speak up a little louder again, please. Sorry, but
the Ibn Hazm of Cordova addresses this issue by saying, and he was of Christian descent. He was a Muslim from a Christian family who had converted to Islam, like most of the great intellectuals of Al-Andalus were of Christian descent. And Ibn Hazm writes that Islam is directly opposed to Christianity. He hated Christianity, and that the Umayyads were the greatest defenders of the faith against the infidels. And this professor also writes that the Christian population lived on for centuries in Al-Andalus with legal rights and relative freedom of worship. Well, as I said, by the time the Christian Spaniards entered Valencia in the Reconquest, there were no Christians in Valencia left. And, by the time Granada capitulated in 1492, there were no Christians left there except those who were slaves.
they were tolerated so much they disappeared.
Right.
Let me ask you too about something you write about in your book is the way that modern scholars misuse the term jihad. And that they attribute the Muslim conquest of Spain, as well as the other conquests following the death of Muhammad, to anything but Islam. They're eager to reduce the role of religion in these conquests and to redefine jihad in an incorrect way. Can you speak about that for a second, please?
Well, what happens is that they may be right, and the interpreters of Islam in the Middle Ages were wrong. Because if you read the chronicles and the treatises from the Middle Ages by Islamic writers and thinkers, every time they dedicate a chapter in their treatises to jihad, the only thing they talk about in those chapters is jihad as war against the infidels. You will not find in those chapters on jihad any reference to jihad being some kind of spiritual self-improvement of the individual Muslim. But of course, they
just what modern scholars say, correct? That's what so many modern scholars claim, ahistorically.
Modern scholars may be right. Let's put it that way. I'm being sarcastic here.
Well, no, yeah. All right. We see that often at Campus Watch in Middle East Studies, in which jihad is claimed to be, as you say, an inner struggle. But whenever whenever an act of terrorism occurs, or whenever one discusses the Muslim conquests of the late antiquity and the Middle Ages, it's never jihad. It's never because of the spread of Islam. They're just looking for booty and conquest of land and wealth, but never motivated by religious beliefs.
My point is that these so-called Islamists may be also misinterpreting the religion, like those experts in the Middle Ages did, and the religious military leaders of Islam also did, and the great Islamic scholars like al-Maliki and al-Shafi and al-Qayrawani and all the classic writers about Islam, when they write about jihad, they may be just making a big mistake when they talk about only as war, armed or otherwise, against the infidels to extend the power of Islam so that the whole world submits to Islam.
Sure, sure. Well, who are medieval Islamic scholars to argue with modern professors of Western background who want to deny what they say? Let me ask you something else, if I can, Darío, to move on since we don't have a lot of time. Another part of the myth that certainly I encountered in graduate school, and I think most people who went to college or high school and have read about this will encounter, is the assertion that the Arabs in medieval Spain preserved and saved Greek learning in particular for the West and passed it along eventually to the Renaissance scholars and therefore to ourselves, and that without this, we would have lost Greek learning. That's not quite true, is it?
No, on the contrary, the Greek texts from classical times were preserved and commented upon by the scholars and monks of the Christian Greek Roman Empire, called incorrectly Byzantine, for centuries. And many of those texts eventually did get to Europe. St. Thomas Aquinas, for example, read Aristotle in a translation by Bishop William of Moerbeke, who was a Catholic bishop in Greek Corinth, and who did many translations from the Greek to Latin. And so Thomas Aquinas read it in those translations. So those texts were there, preserved and commented upon for centuries. And then when the Arabs conquered the Greek, Christian Greek territories in the Middle East and Anatolia and so forth, they had some of the caliphs had Christians translate from the Greek to Syriac, and then from Syriac to Arabic those texts. Few of them, not a lot of the corpus.
Could you speak up just a little louder? Sorry to keep asking you that, but we're having problems with the transmission a little bit. So.
Yes, so those texts. Did you hear when I said that those texts had been preserved in the Christian Greek Roman Empire?
Why don't you repeat that, please, just briefly?
Those texts had been preserved for centuries and commented upon in the Christian Greek Roman Empire, the so-called Byzantine Empire. And from those Greeks, they did go to Europe with some difficulty because of the Islamic control of the Mediterranean and the enmity that eventually developed between the papacy and the Church of the Christian Greek Roman Empire. But many of them did, and Thomas Aquinas read Aristotle in translations from William of Moerbeke, who was a Catholic bishop in Corinth. What happens was that some of those texts were translated by Christians in the Middle East from Greek to Syriac, and from Syriac to Arabic, in not the best of the world translations either, and they were garbled, by being translated from one language and then from another to another. And those were the texts that Muslim scholars used. But no, those texts had been preserved. In fact, experts in libraries point out that over 80% of the classical texts that we now have in the West come from the work of the scribes and copyists of Constantinople and the Christian Greek Roman Empire.
Sure.
So a huge percentage, the majority of those texts come from the libraries of Constantinople and from the scholars of Constantinople. So that is nonsense. There's a French scholar named Sylvain Guggenheim who has written a book called Aristotle, Mont Saint-Michel, in which he treats precisely this issue. It has not been translated into English. So that's nonsense.
How does this myth start, and why do you think it's so ensconced in Middle East studies, Islamic studies, in your own field, in the studies of medieval Spain? Because it seems to me to be ubiquitous. It's rare. Your voice is a rare one in academe, and I know that you have been roundly attacked for what you have written. But how does this start, and why is it so accepted, so unquestionably accepted?
Even in the United States and England, I'm the only one, but in Spain, there have been great scholars like Serafín Fanjul, the Arabist, and Felipe Mayo Salgado, the Arabist at the University of Salamanca, and Sanchez Saus, who is a medieval historian in Spain. And so in Spain, there have been voices.
Well, in the English-speaking world, why do you think it's so predominant?
Yeah, basically none. Yeah, and why all this happened in academia is the result of many factors, and I will mention only one: the stakeholders' interests. Many academics who write about and teach about Islam or the Spanish Middle Ages do not want to present their subject, which they love. It's important to point out they love the subject, and which is the bread and butter on which they publish under such unfavorable light. And they will fight tooth and nail anyone who does. Now, in addition, there are prestigious Western universities and Middle East studies programs receive huge donations from Islamic countries, from Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, Libya under Gaddafi, and so forth. So academics do not want to jeopardize their careers or even travel into Islamic lands by highlighting the issues examined here.
I bet the role of is what we call Islamophilia, that is to say the desire for anything other, anything that's not Western, especially anything that's not Spanish Catholic, but this clinging to the belief that if it isn't Western, it must be superior to what is Western, and therefore denying medieval Spain the credit that it deserves, or the scholars who in Constantinople or anywhere else, just out of sheer despisal of the West.
Yes, that's the ideological factor to add to the stakeholders' interests, and that's another one of several factors in the creation and insistence and the lack of teaching about the reality of things and the insistence on the myth. Yes.
Sant Gupta, one of our viewers today, asked the question: how can the truth about Islamic rule in Spain be spread across academia and so-called interfaith settings?
Well, again, because of stakeholders' interests that I have pointed out briefly there, also ideological reasons that you pointed out, in a cultural agenda, which may be traced back to the European Enlightenment. So all these factors, and to those we should add, as I mentioned, the enormous amounts of money that Islamic countries have poured.
How can let me just ask you, the question was how can we overcome all of that? What can be done to spread the truth about medieval Spain and spread the truth about the falsity of this myth of Andalusia, and just get more accurate information about the period you cover out both into academe, but also into popular culture? Because I would argue this myth is very prevalent in popular culture as well. If you ask the average educated person about it, they will probably spout the myth without even knowing what they're talking about, really. It's just one of these things that's become common wisdom.
Well, exactly. I suggest that they check my book and the notes. And the notes are full of references to actual Islamic medieval treatises used in Spain. And they can, the reader can quote those materials there, which I do. So the reader doesn't even have to quote me. He can quote the material that I quote in my book. And,
so familiarize yourself with the primary sources. Read the sources left over from that period. Don't rely on biased historians living now or over the past century or so to paint the picture of this period for you.
Exactly. So refer to the sources that you can read, and many of those sources some of those sources at least are available even online. And if you read Spanish, you can read Arabists like Serafín Fanjul and Felipe Maillo Salgado to complement your learning and do diffuse. Mention those original treatises that I referred to in my book. Look, Felipe Mayo Salgado points out that Christians and Jews could not possibly have had such a good life in Al-Andalus because legally, they were subaltern citizens vis-a-vis the Islamic population. And he gives several examples. Let me give one of...
Well, what is subaltern? Can you define that term for our audience?
I'm sorry, say that again?
Subaltern, yes.
The niece, yes, subaltern.
What does that mean? I'm asking for our audience. Can you define it, please, for us?
They were in a subaltern condition, in a submissive condition, vis-a-vis the Muslim population. And Felipe Mayo Salgado points out, gives many examples. For example, if a Muslim killed a dhimmi, Muslim killed a Christian, even if he killed a Christian intentionally, he must not suffer the death penalty. However, if a Christian killed a Muslim, even in self-defense, he must be killed. You can see there the difference in legal treatment. In fact,
so they were dhimmis, right? They were all, the Christians and the Jews were always dhimmis under Muslim rule in Spain, just as they would be in other parts of the world. Were conquered by Muslims.
We placed them in a subaltern, a condition of inferiority vis-a-vis Muslims. And euphemistically, dhimmi means protected, which is very interesting because you may ask yourself, protected from what? Protected from what would happen to them if they did not follow the statutes of the rules of the contract.
Right, protected from the Muslims who were ruling them.
Yeah, the life of a Christian was worth half that of a Muslim. The testimony of a Christian was invalid in court in a case among Muslims. And in a case involving Christians and Muslims, the testimony of the Christian was worth only half that of a Muslim male. And it was therefore equal to that of a Muslim female, which was half that of a Muslim male. I mean, that's another myth. The treatment of the women in Al-Andalus. No, they had circumcision. They have stoning. Averroes, the great Andalusian philosopher, who was in fact a Sharia judge, Ibn Rushd, wrote that it's not necessary to dig a hole in the ground to stone an adulterous woman. It's not necessary. You can stone her without the hole in the ground.
Good Lord. Let me ask you a question from our audience. So Ron says, what about the Jewish golden age of scholarship in Spain? Wasn't this happening under Muslim rule? Was there a Jewish age of scholarship in medieval Spain?
Yes, this is also has to be nuanced. There were great Jewish scholars in Islamic Spain. There was a flourishing, if you will, but they too were at the mercy of the will and the laws of the Islamic state. The great physician Maimonides, for example, he was used by Muslims. Why? Because he was a great physician. And that's the principle when Muslims use Christians or Jews. Yes, because they wanted to take advantage of whatever skills they had, but they were still not on an equal on equal terms with the Muslims. And of course, even Maimonides, who may or may not have converted to Islam, by the way, to save his head, Maimonides eventually fled this paradise of Al-Andalus and fled to Egypt. Yes, that is the situation. Of course, there were massacres of Jews because the general Muslim population hated them. So there were massacres in some of the cities in Al-Andalus, massacres of Jews.
We have a question or comment too from Jose Enrique Montero Camacho, who says he's been to Cordoba and that your book is almost heresy there in Cordoba. He says he agrees mostly with you, but he posits that recognizing Muslim superiority as that is legally with Jews behind them and then Christians last, he posits that they got along reasonably well. How were relations there compared to other parts of the Muslim world? Relations between those three adherents to those three religions.
Well, imagine yourself living in a country where legally the law stipulates those things that I have mentioned. Another condition of inferiority was the sexual inferiority in which the Mis were placed. A Muslim man, if he could afford it, could have, as you know, about 4 wives, and he could marry a Christian woman, and then the children would have to be raised as Muslims. But a Christian could not even look at a Muslim woman. So you can see how that is gradually affecting the demographics of the land. Even without conversions, you find that Muslims can marry the Christian woman, adhere to his wives, but then the children had to be raised up as Muslims. But the Christian cannot do that with a Muslim woman. Moreover, the Muslim man could go to the marketplace and buy himself Christian sexual slaves, which he could add and bring in and had children with them, and the children would have to be raised as Muslims too. But Christians could not buy Muslim slaves. So you can see how this condition of subalternity, specified by the Islamic laws, which of course all are religiously based, impacted the demographics and the condition of the Christians in such a land. Now, if you can live under those conditions and happily, well, more power to you. But imagine how that would be for someone who doesn't.
Exactly. I have a question too from Isaac Cohen, who says, I have read that the Jews in Spain suffered under the Visigoths, that is the Germanic invaders who captured Spain from the Romans as the Roman Empire of the West fell apart. They suffered from virulent anti-Semitism and welcomed the Arab invasion of Spain. The Muslims gave authority to the Jews to run the cities they conquered. Under the Umayyad and Abu Rahman III, the Jews were very well treated according to several books that Mr. Cohen has read. Everything went down the drain after the Almoravids took over. When the Almohades invaded, the convivencia ended and Jews had to convert to Islam or get killed. Could you address that, please?
Yes, it is true that the Visigothic laws were anti-Jewish. And so when the Muslims invaded, the Jewish community, certainly the leadership, sided with the Islamic invaders, which would be logical. Hey, this is a chance for us to live better and escape all these laws that the Visigoths have imposed on us. And in fact, the invaders placed Jewish garrisons in some of the main cities conquered, so that the Muslim armies could continue moving rapidly without having to leave any strong force behind. So that helped the rapidity of the movement of the Muslim armies who could show up unexpectedly in another city, because the Jewish garrisons were guarding the conquered cities. So that is certainly logical. But again, the Jews remained at the mercy of the Islamic rulers and the conquerors. Again, they were used, like Christians were used, to help the rulers, but always in a condition of inferiority. In fact, the laws said that the Christians and the Jews could not be referred to as allies. You could not ally yourself with these people. They should be referred to as servants. So so-and-so is serving us to do this, so-and-so is serving us. We're not even consider allies. So you can see again the nuances in this conception of the fantastic Jewish life in Al-Andalus or elsewhere.
Sure. Dan asks, do you have an estimate of the population fraction of Muslims versus Christians in various parts of Andalusian Spain or over time?
No, I don't. What I have is, as I mentioned, that by the time the Christians entered Valencia in the 13th century, there were no Christians left there. So we're talking already the 13th century. And by the 15th century, when the Christians entered Granada in 1492, as I said, there were no Christians left there except as slaves.
And these Christians had fled, been enslaved, sent to North Africa,
yeah,
converted.
the disappearance of the Christian population was the result of the demographic phenomenon that I have explained because of the sexual inferiority. So even without conversions, gradually the Muslim population increased and the Christian population decreased. In addition to that, there were many Christians fled to the Christian north, and in addition to that, many Christians converted to Islam, so that the majority of the great intellectuals of Al-Andalus were of Christian origin, like was Ibn Rushd, Averroes, or the great physician Al-Qasim, Al-Sawairi. They were of Christian origin, families who had converted to Islam. And finally, there were also expulsions. The Almoravids expelled the Christians of Granada to North Africa. And the Almohads also carried out lots of expulsions. So all those factors contributed to the eventual disappearance of most Christians from Al-Andalus.
Sure. Well, we have reached the end of our webinar. I will hold up a picture of the book. This is Professor Dario's book, published in 2016. It's heavily footnoted, as he mentioned before, with the primary sources, many of which have been translated into English. And it's a fascinating discussion, and it's a problem that isn't going away anytime soon. I hope it receives more scholarly attention. So Darío, thank you again for joining us today. We're most grateful to you. Thank you so much. We've enjoyed it tremendously.
Inviting me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. I'm going to remind our audience to be attuned this weekend for emails announcing next week's webinars and podcasts. And with the conclusion of this, I want to wish you all a very good weekend and thank you for joining us. Please join us again soon. Bye-bye.